We're here at Pitzhanger Manor Gallery in Ealing, West London, with artist Alison Watt ahead of her exhibition From Light.
I mean, what I think really drew me to Pitzhanger Manor itself was that it had a great personal significance for Soane, and to such an extent that in one of his Royal Academy lectures he described it as a self-portrait, and that was really intriguing to me. And I think his relationship with his fellow architect and artist Joseph Michael Gandy sets the tone, because Gandy was able to visualise for Soane when he first bought Pitzhanger in order to transform it. And between them, collaborating together, Gandy produced this extraordinary series of watercolours which are really luminous and vivid in terms of their portrayal of Soane's vision for the house. And I think that the watercolours stand as a testament not only to the symbiotic relationship between both architects, but also to the passion and the emotion contained within the work of each, because Soane didn't commission topological drawings. These are very, very different what Gandy produced, and between them they give us a vision of spaces in which you can imagine and spaces of invention. So they're really extraordinary, and the watercolours were quite influential in some of the work that I made, particularly around the house, because they refer to Soane's love of nature, and there are so many architectural details and decorations in the house which refer to nature. From in the library, on the ceiling, there's a gently vaulted ceiling and it's painted with trellises and vines. In the breakfast room, the ceiling becomes the sky in the form of this incredible painted canopy. And his watercolour of the eating room is, you see Soane framing the outside with these great windows. So you see the flowering gardens to the front and the parkland to the rear. So nature is throughout the house, and it had an impact on the botanical paintings that I made. Particularly a work called Le Ciel, which is in the eating room. It's one of the larger works, and it takes its inspiration from the gardens and the parkland at Pitzhanger, but also Le Ciel takes its title from the painted sky in the breakfast room.
And the title of the whole show, From Light, light's always been really a significant part of your work.
Yes, and also I think when we think of Soane, that's the first thing that you think of. In a way, there was no debate in my head about what the title of the show should be, because as soon as I think of Soane, I think about light, because he had mastery of light in his buildings, and he had a way of harnessing light to such an extent that it becomes almost like a character in his buildings, because it affects mood and atmosphere, and these things are synonymous with Soane. And I think Pitzhanger seems to stand as almost a personal testament to his trajectory as an architect, someone who's obsessed with the workings of light and space. So, but you're right, the title also comes from my own obsession with light, because I really believe that light is part of the substance of a painting.
And how do you bring it into the painting? Because from a distance, one sees white, but close up there's actually a lot of colours. What's your process like?
My process involves very intensive looking. The objects I paint, often I paint very simple objects like a piece of paper or a piece of cloth or a feather or a book. But I've looked very closely at how these objects absorb the light and retain it, but also reflect it. And sometimes when light clings to the surface of an object, it causes it to glow. And I think light can have a huge impact on, I think, the potential of an object, because it can transform something that was otherwise ordinary, and it can give something very everyday dignity. So light is incredible in its transformative power in terms of something very ordinary.
Your fabric, your tablecloth edges, they're really quite ordinary, but they become really special when they're sort of the focus of the whole work.
Yeah, I've been painting fabric. The fabric series has been going on for many years, and it's evolving. If you saw my fabric paintings 20 years ago, these new paintings are quite different. But the thing that they all have in common is that they're all full of historical references. There's a multitude of references in the fabric paintings, whether it be the paintings of Zurbarán or the 17th century Spanish still life with its tradition of placing an object in a shallow picture plane in raking light, or also religious iconography. And when I worked at the National Gallery as associate artist, I was able to study Zurbarán's work really closely. And of course, he's a master of painting fabric. And it's not just, I think the extraordinary nature of the work is not just because of its incredible plasticity, but also because of how his fabric makes you feel. You know, it's fabric to be touched and to be listened to. And I think that's extraordinary because he has the ability to imbue a very simple object with a life beyond its original purpose. And I'm really interested in that, because by taking the objects away from any surroundings or narrative and presenting them in isolation, then it allows for another narrative to form, or perhaps any number of narratives.
So for example, the skull behind you, I mean, that could have many stories attached to it.
Well, the skull behind me, it's entitled Vanitas, and it relates to Soane's relationship with the great sculptor John Flaxman. He and Flaxman were very close friends, and Flaxman was a leading figure in neoclassicism in the 18th century, both in Britain and in Europe. And during his lifetime, Flaxman would have produced numerous drawings, anatomical drawings, using human bones and muscles. And Soane also commissioned and collected his work. And after Flaxman died, Soane acquired several items from Flaxman's studio, including a human skeleton. So this painting refers to that. And also the fact that Flaxman would have used, undoubtedly would have used the human skeleton as an aid in his work. And there's also references to memento mori and how artists throughout history have always been fascinated by death, as Soane was. So I think there's a multitude of references in the human skull.
And did you work from the actual skull in the collection to paint that? Or?
The way I worked was I worked with the Anatomy Museum as part of Edinburgh University in the medical school. So I was given special access to human remains, and this skull is not worked directly from one single skull, it's a composite image. But it was really incredible because historically artists were always able to work in this way, but obviously now it's much more difficult for all sorts of reasons to work from human specimens. And I've spent my whole life working from life in terms of life models. So to work from death was a different experience, but equally fascinating.
Talking of memento mori, can you say something about the series of roses downstairs?
Yes, the Rose series are a sequence of paintings which make up a whole, and each painting is complete in itself, but I wanted to make a series in order to invite dialogue and comparison between the paintings. And in art history, images of flowers have often been used to signify purity or youth, but I think the rose in particular has often been seen as a symbol of the fragility of life, of death and decay. And I think in this setting it seems particularly apt because Soane had a great fascination with death throughout his life. And I wanted to look at the evolution of a rose, both metaphorically and formally, because as soon as a rose is picked, it's dying. It has so little time once it's cut. And I think that's really fascinating because the rose seems to exist simultaneously in life and death as an object. It's in a sort of perpetual state of departure, which I find really fascinating. So it has animation before it fades, it leans, it stretches, it extends. And I wanted to, in some way, by making the series, to somehow try and portray that movement in the death of the rose.
What about the series of death masks?
The death mask, the death mask which I've painted exists now. You can see the death mask in John Soane's museum in Lincoln's Inn Fields. And the mask in the house has a label which tells us what Soane thought he was buying, because Soane was mistaken when he bought the skull, which is actually very unusual for Soane because Soane was very careful about the things that he collected, but for some reason he was duped. And Soane bought the death mask believing it was someone who was infamous in his time called Richard Parker. And Richard Parker was a naval mutineer, and he'd become infamous because he had been involved in a blockade on the Thames with his fellow mutineers, and he was captured and he was hanged on his own ship, the Sandwich. So Soane was fascinated by this character and wanted to have a representation of him. And it was only after Soane's death, looking at other death masks, that it was discovered that it was actually Oliver Cromwell. And the reason that I wanted to paint it in triptych was a reference to Oliver Cromwell's nemesis, Charles I, and the amazing portrait by Van Dyck, the image of 3 Charles I. So that's why there are 3 paintings of Oliver Cromwell. But also what really fascinated me about Cromwell was, in all the paintings that I've seen of Cromwell, he's portrayed as being incredibly ugly, very scarred and pockmarked and really not attractive. But in the death mask, I think he's beautiful. And I find that really interesting, how he has been misrepresented in the way that he's been painted after his death.
And those works are really ephemeral. I mean, it's almost as if they are painted with light.
I mean, I was very keen to present them in quite a dramatic setting. And again, it was making reference to Soane's use of light, because there's often darkness in his use of light, there's often drama. You only have to look at Gandhi's watercolours to see how his mind is working. And I think in Pitzhanger itself, there are so many references to the mausoleum, the sarcophagus, the urn. So his interest in death is actually throughout the house. So he has a way of finding darkness and light, which I find really fascinating.
And the breakfast room, that's slightly less dark, but you've put objects in there as well as works.
Yeah, the breakfast room is much more intimate as a space. And I was asked if I would like to put something on the shelves, and I decided to take items which were really personal to me and that I have in the studio. And actually I really miss having these things now that I've agreed to part with these objects for the duration of the show. I'm actually missing them, because objects around you, and I don't know if you feel this, but objects around you act as almost like a steadying influence. So when you don't have them, you really notice it. So now that they're presented in the breakfast room, I'm almost looking at these objects anew. But they involve, there's a little sculpture by the artist Kenny Hunter, who's a dear friend, of a skull. And there is also a goat skull, and there is a drawing of a skull. And it was only when I brought the objects here that I realised how much my own work related to death. And it wasn't really something I'd thought about until I took these objects and presented them, because normally they're just in amongst everything that's in the studio. So it was really fascinating for me, and it made me think about how things can change depending on how they're presented.
Mm-hmm. And it's sort of fitting with the title as well, that death kind of comes from light.
Yes, yeah.